Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast where we talk about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. I'm your host, Travis Jamieson. In this episode, I'm joined by theologian and author Andrew Root, who along with his wife, Kara, wrote a beautiful and deeply reflective book about their family's 2022 pilgrimage through Scotland, following the way of St. Cuthbert. Their journey, though, became more than just a hike. It was an invitation to let go of control in parenting, in pastoring, and in life, and to make space for what philosopher Hartmut Rosa calls resonance. Those moments when we encounter something outside ourselves that changes us. Together, Andrew and I talk about what it means to live faithfully in a world obsessed with efficiency and control, and how both parenting and ministry might look different when we open ourselves up to the uncontrollable presence of God. Here's my conversation with Andrew Root. Well, Andrew Root, thanks for being on the Faith Informing Podcast with us today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. You're there in cold Minnesota. We're over here in warm California. So how did you end up in Minnesota teaching at Luther Seminary? What was kind of your trajectory to that point?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm from here originally, so
Okay.
this was a kind of coming home. I grew up in the eastern suburbs of St. Paul, which if you were to ask me where I'm from, I would say Minneapolis. If I was in Northern California, because no one really knows St. Paul. Except if you live here. If you live here, it makes a big difference if you're from St. Paul or Minneapolis, and I'm a St. Paul guy. And it makes a big difference because Minneapolis people are snooty and St. Paul people are salt of the earth people. So
That's always the way it goes.
it's a stereotype that I win with, so I like to
Yeah,
continue to
absolutely.
perpetuate that stereotype. But I grew up here. So I grew up in the cold winters. I was Yeah, it's weird because when I think about the pie chart of my life now, it used to be I would tell my story. It was like, yeah, I was out of the state for almost 8 years,
Hmm.
both coasts, getting educated. So I'm not completely a Minnesotan. I lived in Southern California and I lived in New Jersey. But now when you look at the pie chart of my life, it's just pretty much all here. So it's just like a little blip on the radar now of not being in the upper Midwest. So yeah, we came back here when we had our first child. He was not even one, and he's now a junior in college. And so that brought us back to the cold weather.
Oh, okay. That's great to hear that. What school did you go to in Southern California?
I was a Fuller grad, so I did an MDiv and an
Okay.
THM at Fuller, and then went across the way for doctoral work.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's awesome. I know a number of people at Fuller, and it's lots of good people down there. Yeah. So you mentioned your son. You recently wrote a book alongside your wife, where you tell the story of you and your wife and son and daughter go on this pilgrimage in Scotland. And I think when I read this, your son was like graduating high school. So it's been a
Yeah,
few years since you've done this now.
yeah.
But what was the kind of the reason for why you went on this pilgrimage as a family? Because I know lots of Christian families, and not many of them are doing pilgrimages that I know of.
Well, I will say we did do Disney, years
Oh,
earlier. So it's not this great pietist spirit that, is like don't give in to the consumerist machine, go on a medieval walk. It
yeah.
wasn't quite that pietistic or noble, really. I mean, I guess the impetus of this is like really twofold. I mean, one is my wife Cara, who's a Presbyterian pastor. She's a bit, if not a all out mystic. Like she reads the mystics, she likes the mystics, she's studying the mystics. So she got this kind of in her mind that she wanted to do a pilgrimage. And one of the things that we've done is, I've traveled quite a bit, giving presentations and lectures and things like that. And my big rule is I have to just be on one airline. So I don't know what airline sponsors your podcast here, so I don't want to make
Right.
any problems here.
Oh
But
yeah, we have a huge sponsor from, all kinds of airlines.
yeah, I'm sure United Airlines just gives
Yes.
you big time bucks here. But
Yeah.
I'm a Delta guy, so I only fly Delta, partly because it's a hub here in the Twin Cities, but it's also just allowed me to kind of use miles and pay those miles forward to my children. So my
Hmm.
kids have gone around the world because of award tickets, really. And so we would travel, somewhere to Europe or even to Australia or something, and we'd be in Sydney. And it was like we didn't have any money to do anything else. We got them there because we had a free ticket, and it was
Yeah.
like, we're just going to walk. So since they were like 4 or 5, we've just walked cities, and like the best times we've had as a family is walking. So when Kara said she wanted to actually walk a pilgrimage, it just made sense that we try to do this as a
Mm.
family. So we planned it, and it was ready to go in summer 2020, and looked like nothing was going to stop that. And then this little illness came around that shut everything down for a year, and then I replanned the whole trip for 21, and then it got canceled again. Europe opened, but Scotland never opened without a 14-day quarantine. So
Right, right.
it got pushed off to 22, and we finally did it August 22, and it became, I don't know if it was providential, or I mean, it became a very different vibe because now we had a rising senior about to start a senior year of high school, and it's been a battle of firstborns. Like, both Car and I are firstborn children, and raising a firstborn has been like the battle of wills for control, between the three of us. So like this book is more of a confession. It's not any kind of parenting specialist book. We have no clue how to do this well. We just know trying to control our kids has not worked well, and particularly for our oldest. And if he would have been more malleable, maybe this would be a very different book, a very obnoxious one about how we had it all figured out. But
Mhm.
he refused to be controlled. And this walk, after a kind of years of a lot of conflict, good times, but conflict too. It really was a spiritual walk of us kind of letting our kids go. And it also
Mhm.
coincided with kind of mid-career. And we were kind of 90s youth group kids, that were told, like, we're going to change the church. And, isn't the church lucky to have us and our passions and skills? And, yeah, like the church needed us more than we needed the church, which is an odd kind of heresy that we were just kind of taught in big conference youth group Protestantism. But this was mid-career too, of kind of letting go of that illusion and trying to come back to a deeper sensibility that the church could parent us and we didn't need to parent it, and maybe we also needed to let off the gas of controlling our own kids. And so it became really a pilgrimage of letting go, which is a kind of
Mm.
classic way that pilgrimages, since the medieval period, have been about, of kind of letting go and seeking God. And for us, it became a kind of mid-career church leadership and parenting kind of letting go.
Yeah, can you say a bit more about that, kind of the background of the idea of the pilgrimage? Um, like a letting go. What do you mean by that? And like what's kind of your understanding theologically of what's going on, or what's the goal of pilgrimages?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, we made a joke about Disney starting this, and there's in some ways no way to escape this. Like, you get on an airplane, you fly somewhere, you go through an airport. So tourism is just soaked into this thing. But a
Hmm.
pilgrimage is supposed to be something very different than being a tourist. Like a tourist leaves home to kind of have an experience, take that experience in, enjoy that experience, and then leave. But a pilgrimage is something much more existential, and obviously something much more spiritual, where it is really a walk of saying goodbye in many ways.
Mm.
And I work this more in this evangelism book that we'll talk about more than in this book that I did with my wife. But there's a sense that goes back to particularly French thinkers, that when you did a pilgrimage, you first of all gave a will and testament. So you actually had to do your will before you would walk off onto this pilgrimage, because you didn't know if you were going to return.
Hmm.
And you would do it with this kind of sense of ad diem, this kind of sense of it being to God. So you're always, as opposed to a tourist who's just trying to have an experience, a pilgrimage, you're aimed towards something. You're walking towards something outside of you that has some kind of holy resonance to it that you're moving towards. You're moving towards God in some way with each of these steps. But in the high medieval period, especially in France, ad diem was also an idiom for goodbye. So when you would
Oh,
like when we sign off on this podcast, we could say ad diem, like
uh-huh.
to God. You can still hear it in some of our languages, like, adios or adieu, that you can still hear that kind of that Latin ad diem in it. And
Hmm.
so a pilgrimage really is, it's a walk of suffering in the sense, not just of like people doing it barefoot and things like that, which really happened, but it was a kind of saying goodbye to your life to aim towards something holy. And so for us, what made it holy was, we were still on the infrastructure of tourism, like I was still getting my miles, yeah.
Yeah.
I
You're
wasn't
getting your
not getting my miles.
right.
Yes. And, we were eating Cinnabon or whatever, in the airport, but we were trying to do this in a sense ad diem, really working hard to remind ourselves that we walk this towards God, and that it did become almost as a surprise to us that it was a saying goodbye to a certain phase of being a parent, a certain
Mm.
phase of our own careers, that it was a kind of release in liberation in that way of certain ruts that we've gotten ourselves into, or certain perspectives that maybe weren't so helpful, that it was a saying goodbye to those kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah, you in the book you I think your wife Kara wrote them, but there's these little liturgies throughout. But you on
Mm.
your pilgrimage, you write about how you did these daily prayers, kind of morning, noonday, and evening prayers with your family, and that was all part of like trying to set this up to be towards God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, which was, praying a liturgy, doing morning prayer, midday prayer, and evening prayer with teenagers is your own teenagers particularly is always a challenge. But our kids were kind of into it. They had gone to youth front camp in Kansas City where they do that kind of thing, so they were very familiar with it. But one of the funnier moments is when we you would meet these people, and the book is filled with these very kind of Seinfeld-esque like encounters with people that were very immature, kind of 90s corrupted mind people, where we don't remember anyone's name, so we just give them a nickname behind their back,
Yeah.
and so like everyone we meet on the path ends up having a name, like Banana Split and the Three Maidens. Was we met a guy who was super into ice cream. Like we met him in a little, like one of our first encounters. Our first encounter was on the trail, and then we saw him at this restaurant. He's like, "This Banana Split is amazing." Completely forgot his name, so we just called him Banana Split the
Yeah,
whole time. And you'd
of
see
course.
these people walking, and he was with three women. He was walking with his wife and two other friends, so he just became Banana Split and the Three Maidens. So we made up all of these names for people, and our mind was very corrupted that way. So. But yeah, it became.
I totally relate with that. We still call this one kid from college. We just call him. He's just known as fiance boy because he got engaged so fast, and so he's
Yeah, yeah.
always in the family just known as fiance boy. I have no idea what his name is.
The best is when you just put boy behind it.
Yeah,
Anything boy is great.
exactly.
But one of the funnier moments of these prayer cards is that we met the honeymooners. They were honeymooners, so they became known as the honeymooners, and they were Episcopal priests, and walking this. And Cara gave one of the prayer cards to these honeymooners because they said they had forgot their prayers, and Maisie just about melted in embarrassment for her mom passing on prayer cards. So they were fine. It was just the four of us praying, but if we kind of opened that up to the scope of anyone beyond the four of us, then they were deeply humiliated by it. So
I just, well, because we're going to talk about evangelism as well, I just imagine her handing out these prayer cards as forms of tracts. Just,
Yeah, right, right, right. Yeah, we were just anyone we would see. We like, have you ever heard of the four spiritual laws? You
yeah,
know? Yeah,
exactly. Let me take you through the Romans road.
right, exactly. Yeah,
Yes, yeah, yeah. That's so great though. But in that book, the big question that you guys are talking about so much is, why are we so obsessed with control?
yeah,
And I think that's like such a relatable question because I think innately, most people living, you know, a normal life in America today can just know that they are obsessed with control, that we're so anxious about making sure we have everything under control in our lives and everything's rearranged. Like we have our calendars on our phone and we have our alerts going off and our alarms. And, like I was just recently at a park with my kids and there was a mom and it was just like her alarm was going off and she was like, look, it's time to go. It's my alarm. Like, and it's like,
yeah.
just kind of this obsession with control. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about like, you know, what did you find not only in your in the pilgrimage that you experienced about letting go of control, but like what have you through your research, discovered
Yeah.
about like, why are we so focused on control um and why is that a current issue for us?
Yeah. Well, one of the, at least for the last, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, a dialogue partner of mine has been this German sociologist named Hartmut Rosa. And so I've tried to kind of academically work with his work. But he wrote a really little book that's really excellent called The Uncontrollability of the World.
Mm,
And it's really this deep sense where what he's getting at is what happens in a modern world is that everything just keeps going faster and faster, and we see it as a high good to continue to accelerate our lives. And he thinks this is just the reality of being modern. That modernity itself, as the modern project, is just trying to speed up transportation, communication, production. Like my big example of this is I've just discovered this a few years ago that airline travel is actually slower now than it was even 10 years ago because the routes, like to fly Minneapolis to LA, it's 15 minutes slower because airlines are slowing down the routes to save fuel costs.
oh,
And when I discovered that, I was super angry. Like I was super, super angry because the idea is we assume, even as a moral good, that things will just keep going faster and faster. We should be 10 minutes faster, not 10 minutes slower. Now 10 years on, and so there's this certain kind of way that the modern project is always about going faster and faster. But he really warns us against that and thinks that in this reality, what happens is that it frames our sense of the good life, and we tend to see the good life as accumulation of more and more. And it ends up having the effect of disconnecting us from ourselves, from one another, from the world itself, from the natural realm. Like it just disconnects us, and we can have these huge experiences of burnout and depression that kind of fall upon us in this need to continue to exert more and more energy just to stay in the same place. So
mhm,
the second phase of his project is really looking at a different form of action we need, which we know, but it's hard for us to get to, which is this sense of resonance, this kind of
mhm.
sense of feeling connected. But the real key to that theory is that to have a resonant experience, to have a resonant relationship, that has to be uncontrollable. You can't plan for resonance. You can't produce it and put it in a box and promise it will happen. It's like, saying to your kids on vacation, like, we're going to have fun or else, it
Right.
means it's not going to happen. Or, like trying to have a romantic date and being like, we have to have a romantic date. It almost guarantees that you're trying to control it too much and it can happen. So this little book he writes really is about this one dynamic of his larger theory of resonance of how we need to embrace the uncontrollable. And he says, really for the most part, the fact is that us moderns want to control the world so much, it would be utterly absurd if we weren't just so darn good at it. Like we are really
Mm,
good at controlling a lot of the dynamics of the world, like we have all sorts of buildings that control temperature, and like you were just rattling off transportation realities. And I mean, my gosh, we even have refrigerators that now text us that we need to pick up milk, or can just
Mhm.
order it for us and have, Instacart drop it off without us even being aware of it. I mean, if we weren't so good at control, it would seem absurd. I mean, to our ancestors, it would seem absurd how obsessed we are with control. But we've, through technology and through, bureaucratic structures and things like that, we're pretty darn good at it. But the problem is it spins back on us, and it ends up it ends up disconnecting us. It ends up doing more damage at times than good. And so our muscles become so kind of toned, or our muscle memory is so for control, that we lose the spontaneity of being encountered, by
Mm.
art, by one another, and ultimately from a theological and pastoral perspective from God. So there's something really important about this kind of dynamic of the uncontrollable. And I mean, you can see how this plays with middle class parenting style that really, since the probably the 21st century, since the end of the 90s, middle class parenting has really been about controlling your kids, because we feel like if we don't, they'll fall behind. If we don't,
Mhm.
it's not even that we want them to be first round draft picks or get into Ivy League schools. We feel like if we don't help them, they'll never get jobs. They'll fall behind all their peers. They'll not be able to have the standard of living that we have. And so we feel like we got to go, 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 go. And
Mhm.
we end up forming ourselves and thinking that the best parent is managing their kids' lives, hence controlling their kids' life, controlling the outcomes of their kids' life, instead of a parent being someone who has resonant encounters with their children, who actually can be a dialogue partner, where there's a deep discussion that happens, where there's connection. And that's kind of what we're pushing for in the book, is not because we figured it out or because we're good at it, but because we desperately know we need it. And we've tried the other angle of, control, control, control. And it's produced a kind of relational relationlessness, if that's, if
Mhm.
that conundrum makes sense, and this is the fact of modernity. It creates these conditions where we're better at relationships that are relationless, or what Martin Buber would call the I it, than the I thou, or a relationship that's full of relationality.
Yeah, this book reminded me a lot of Jonathan Haidt's book that came out last year, The Anxious Generation.
Mm-hmm.
He's obviously not talking from a like theological viewpoint, but
Yeah.
his whole idea about basically his thing is like we need to let our kids play outside unsupervised, um, is really just this kind of like you got to stop being so obsessed with controlling your kids. And
Mm.
that book really resonated for me. And I know it resonated for many parents, but especially here in Silicon Valley, like uh, in Palo Alto, one of the things that has come up a lot throughout over the years of we've just been here a few years, but one of the big things that has happened is that our local high schools, there's two main high schools in Palo Alto, and there's just been a really high amount of suicide over the years.
Mm.
And so much so that like, 10 years ago, it was like going in the New York Times because
Oh.
it was like a whole cycle of it, this kind of chain of suicides among high school students, and we
Mm.
still have them. Like we've had at least a couple this year, and it's it does seem like a lot of it is kind of because of this environment where people are like, we have to pressure our kids to become successful, and here in Palo Alto, there it's kind of home of the tech executives.
Yeah.
So the success level, the bar is really high. So then to have to like pressure your kids of like, you've got to be as successful as me, they're already like kind of like the 1%. And you're like, wow,
Hmm.
the pressure is like it's over the top. And, recently I was talking to my plumber. He was just fixing some stuff in our house, and he was just saying like you know worked so much with his son to get kind of like do the rat race of trying to get into a good school, and he got into a good school on the East Coast, and he did it all, and then he came back and he got a software job, and then he was like, yeah, I don't like this, and now he's becoming an electrician.
Yeah.
And I was just
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
whoa, like that does not go against our that goes against our current like cultural
yeah,
narrative. Like that's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
backwards, but
Yeah,
fascinating.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, really I mean, really fascinating. Yeah, those pressures are really there. And I guess this is an interesting dynamic for you in Silicon Valley. Is there is a kind of sense like any big problem, we should be able to design our way out of it.
Hmm.
Like so you take your kid's life and you think like, how do we design for their future? Which is, design is a certain kind of it's a certain kind of practice of control, and it can be very helpful in some ways. And then, but I don't think it can be equated to everything, and
Mm.
maybe not to the most fundamental dynamics of our relationships with our kids. And I think what we're trying to push here is like in this book is maybe what our kids need from us, and maybe even our congregations need from us, is not a kind of even artistic design specialists that can kind of design their futures, but they need someone to journey with them. They
Mm.
need to be invited into deep conversation, and conversation is always like at its most fundamental. Dialogue is dependent on uncontrollability. I mean, we're having an uncontrollable experience right now. Like,
Hmm.
I don't know what you're gonna say, and maybe it's because we didn't prepare very much, but you didn't give me any questions beforehand. But like if
Yeah.
we like if we were just but if we were, I mean, even more so if this was even a more intimate encounter than recorded to be on a podcast, if we were at a coffee shop just getting to know each other, or we known each other
Right.
for a few years, to have a kind of conversation where I actually hear you. I mean, we've all had those conversations where the person is just quiet, waiting for you to stop so they can start talking. And
Hmm.
those are awful. I mean, those are like awful conversations, and they're draining and they're horrendous. I mean, the most beautiful experiences we have are the uncontrolled conversations where we really are listening and hearing and then responding and being heard. And that back and forth demands some kind of level of uncontrollability. And I guess maybe this is part of the fear of a certain kind of hyper digital age, is that young people, our children, can be in conversations that are never uncontrolled because they're always mediated through a digital space. So, like a text thread gives them up the ability in a good way maybe of the control of when to respond, of how to respond, to think about a response, but they also lose that muscle memory for the uncontrollable and what just happens in a conversation where you're essentially, tossing the ball back and forth in a conversation, and you don't know how it's going to come back to you, and you just have to be, listening and responding. And so our deepest human experiences are always bound with a certain element of uncontrollability.
Hmm. And that really connects to the ministry of the church in the sense that the church can also become a place that's focused on control.
Hmm.
But at its best, it seems to be a place where people encounter God, and we can't control God. Um, and recently I was teaching our youth catechism class, and we were talking about the providence of God. And in the Heidelberg Catechism, it says that everything we have comes from the fatherly hand of God. And it really, that just that one line really speaks against our ability to control life.
Yep.
That actually, if you believe in a God who is providential, who's sovereign over all things, you're saying that, oh, actually, God's behind all of this. And that's a very different posture. But it's actually, I think, hard for us
Hmm.
to live in light of that. Um,
Hmm.
and because I think like we know the controllability structure, like that's just ingrained in us, like how to raise kids in a very controlled setting and way is kind of the only way we know. And so I guess it's like how do you think like, and maybe a pilgrimage is a helpful way of practicing this. Like how do we practice ways of letting go of that control, both in church but also like in our home lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways. I mean, and maybe this bridges us a bit into the other book as well, the evangelism book. But I mean, one of the ways we have to do this is a way we have to suffer it, and that means waiting for it. Like to to not be able to control means that you have to learn to wait. And I think as late moderns, again, middle class people, we hate waiting. Like we feel like waiting is wasting, and the last thing you should do is have to wait. And in some sense, I mean, here we are, talking about Silicon Valley again. I mean, one of the great kind of projects of Silicon Valley is the late sociologist Zygmunt Bauman said this is to take all waiting out of wanting, or
Mm.
the kind of Silicon Valley language for this is to make everything frictionless, like we want everything to be frictionless. And at one level, I love that. Like, I love that my Delta app. See, I'm promoting Delta again. That please send miles to my Sky Miles account. There's that at one level, I love that everything's on my app and it's frictionless. With when I check in for my flight and things like that. But at another level, what it means to be human is the friction. That it's the uncontrollable moments of it being encountered by someone. And I think particularly as you were saying, in relation to the church, like we really are not worshiping God if we think God can be controlled.
Mm.
Like a God who is truly God is uncontrollable, or as the Swiss theologian Karl Barth said, is wholly other. And God is not us with a loud voice. Like God is uncontrollable. And yet, for both Calvin and Luther, the way we know this God is through word. I mean, it's a sense of discourse and dialogue, but it is discourse and dialogue with a God you cannot control, but nevertheless a God who speaks to us, a God who acts for us. But I do think that one of the realities of being a modern person is because we become such control freaks. And in many ways, this gives us kind of illusions that we are God in some sense, that we end up becoming quite we become unable to hear the transcendent word of God speak to us. So we end up kind of spitting out the sawdust of immanence and lose a kind of transcendent quality to our lives. And to get back to that transcendent quality, your question really, it's a few things. It's this waiting, suffering this waiting, but it's also a way of not hiding from our more broken experiences, our experiences of limit and loss. I think we're quite tempted in a world that's accelerated and about control to end up hiding the places in our lives that are broken, that are the moments of real suffering, because we kind of have a sense like ain't no one got time for that. Like people don't want to be they don't want to have they don't want to there no one's there for you in that way. And the just the constitution of the space in which we live. I mean, social media may be good for some things, but it's surely not good for giving consolation to people in the midst of sorrow. Like a sad faced emoji is not the same thing as a Christian brother or sister coming and sitting with you in the midst of your grief or visiting you at the hospital. You know what I mean? Carrying bridge is really important, I think. But it really beckons for the personal encounter more than just the update, in the status update. And so
Mhm.
I think that it does beckon us into spaces where we can actually make confessions of our brokenness and find consolation in those moments. And so it does cause on one level at one level for us to slow down, for us to wait, to hear from God and hear from one another. And then, I mean, this is quite a brave thing to do, I think, in our context, is to to confess our limit, to confess our loss, and seek for consolation in the midst of it.
Mm. Yeah, it makes me think of, as a pastor, part of my role is to visit congregants when they're in the hospital.
Hmm.
And um, I can, maybe back in the day, that was like the only option when people were in the hospital. It's like, you got to go and see them. Nowadays,
Right.
of course, everyone's got their cell phone. So you can just like, I can shoot a text to whoever's in the hospital. And unless they've gone through something catastrophic, they can respond like
Hmm.
right immediately. And so it's funny, like I'll shoot a text and be like, "Hey, how are things going? How are you feeling today?" And like in a sentence or two, they'll kind of sum it up for me, like things are good, or I'm going to be here a few more days, yada yada yada. But that I could go that same day to the hospital in person and then visit with them. And what was communicated in a text actually is like a whole hour's worth of conversation that we then have. And
Right.
it's a totally different experience because it's not mediated through some kind of technological device. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like that encounter, it's, you know, when we're obsessed with controlling the encounter, we miss out on everything. We miss out on
Yeah.
the encounter itself. And it's like,
Hmm.
um, I don't know, and it just, it it makes me just it reminds me a bit about like just like all the more importance of like actually going to visit with people, in
Hmm.
their homes or with friends, and just like, like we had people over for lunch after church on Sunday, and they were new people that we didn't know very well, and that always like causes me a bit of anxiety
Yeah.
because they're coming into your home, you don't know them. There was a bit of a language barrier at times, and the whole time you're like, man, is this going well? Like you're like
Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
in
Right.
my
Right.
head, I'm
Yeah.
like, is
Right.
this? I don't know if this is
Right.
going well at all. And
Right.
but it really was a wonderful time together, even though there were many challenges uh,
Hmm.
in the process to get there. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, I think that going to be with people, and that does that's kind of your premise of your book, Evangelism in the Age of Despair, that we're to follow Jesus into sorrow. And I
Yeah.
love that line. I've been using that with my congregation. Um, you know, just this idea that, when we're sharing the love of Christ, we're gonna go where Christ is. And I,
Hmm.
I wonder, like, what are some of kind of the theological or philosophical, what's some of the philosophical background to that idea of like
Yeah.
that line, especially of like going where Jesus is? Like, I
Hmm.
was raised in the church and I don't think I remember, ever hearing something quite put like that, like, because that seems so concrete.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you can just talk a bit about,
Yeah.
where that comes
Yeah.
from.
Well, I mean, it's a strange book in the sense that it's a book about evangelism, and I feel like anyone who reads it as a kind of classic evangelism book will be deeply disappointed. Like there isn't a bunch of methods or like a eight step way to do evangelism. What I'm really trying to do in the book to answer your question is think about evangelism through the theology of the cross. And
Mhm.
the theology of the cross is kind of what I'm drawing on theologically to make this assertion, that we go where Jesus is present. And so often, like the theology of the cross, I think is often thought of as a kind of cosmic like through a kind of cosmic sense of the atonement theory, which it is in some ways. It is what happens between God and humanity, and the kind of judicial realities of that. But for Luther particularly, the cross also is the hermeneutic, the way to interpret where God is found. And so for Luther, he wants to see the cross as the primary way that then the Christian goes into the world to look for where God might be. And so this is why he really raises up suffering, not because he's really into suffering or things like, he's not a Norwegian metal fan, that's just into darkness and death for the sake of darkness and death. As we're
Yeah.
recording this near Halloween, it's not an obsession with Halloween, though. The 95 Theses were nailed to the
Yeah.
door on Halloween. So I don't know, maybe there is a Halloween corollary here, but it's really this sense of like, where is God at work? Where is Jesus Christ concretely present? Where does God reveal God's self? And for Luther, he wants to see that it's first and foremost primarily in the cross. That this is where God is found. So this little phrase I use, that we follow Jesus into sorrow, it's been this thin line throughout the tradition, that Jesus Christ is with the brokenhearted and with the needy, and that we never go to people who are brokenhearted and needy in a kind of instrumental way, like beyond their humanity, just to get to some kind of religious manifestation. But there is a sense of when we give mercy, care, love to people in that place, and they give it to us and ours, that there's a way that Jesus Christ is present there. And it's because Jesus Christ not only is present as the cross kind of points to, but it also, what the cross relays is that it's not just present in a kind of generic sense, it's present in at work. That Jesus Christ is at work in suffering, death, loss, and limit, bringing new life out of death. And so the Christian is called there, the believer is called there, the disciples called there, because in participation in those experiences, there also is a way, kind of sacramentally, that we encounter the living Christ, and death is death is reworked. Death is shot through with possibility and hope, and not in any human effort to do so, but in this very mystery of the beauty of bearing each other's burdens. Something happens in the midst of it. To be in hell with people who are in hell. And in the Heidelberg Disputation, Luther says this. He says, the theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is. I mean, they call experiences of hell, being a mother with a 4-year-old daughter diagnosed with, stage 3 breast cancer is hell. To be a 4 or 5-year-old and watch your mother die of that cancer, it's hell. But that reality, the cross, beckons us to say that God is present there, that God goes there, that God is at work there, and therefore we're called to be where God is at work, where Jesus Christ is moving and ministering. And so there has to be a bravery in the Christian life, not because it's instrumentalized, not because we're the fixers, not because we're someone who can actually do anything to fix this 4 or 5-year-old who's lost their mother, but because we believe in bearing those burdens and giving consolation. We all encounter the concreteness of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is there at work, and in the mystery of faith, shedding tears with others and holding them in the midst of their suffering also becomes a manifestation of new possibility and new hope, that we participate in that by participating in brokenness and death.
Mm. It reminds me of two passages in Scripture.
Mm.
One, of course, is the New Testament where Jesus is dividing the goats and the sheep. And he's very clear that, like, hey, you'll find me when you clothe the naked and feed the hungry and visit the imprisoned. Like, that's where you're going to find me, because when you do it to those, you do it to me. And then another passage that comes to mind is Deuteronomy 8, where Moses warns the Israelites. He's like, you need to remember what God has done for you and praise God, because you're about to enter the promised land. And when you build your homes and establish your community and you feel prosperous and life is going well, the big temptation is you're gonna forget God.
Mm-hmm.
And those two um, narratives are like just key to the story of the Bible. That, like,
Yeah.
when you become comfortable, wealthy, and prosperous, and life is good, you tend to forget God. When you suffer, you tend to see God a lot more.
Yeah.
And I don't know. That is just it's just like I feel like that is the path of discipleship as a Christian, is
Yeah.
like continuing to really believe that that's true. That, like,
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
actually meet God in the suffering, because so much of life is spent trying to avoid it at all
Mm.
costs.
Yeah, and maybe a biblical story that kind of bridges those two, and even gives us more, practical realities, is the end of Luke in the road to Emmaus. That
Mm,
here are these two travelers who are utterly heartbroken, and um, the narrative they've been living out of has just crashed all around them. And as they share their sorrow, um, all of a sudden, Jesus reveals himself by, eating with them, by hearing their sorrow, hearing and holding their stories, and then giving them a different story, breaking the bread amongst them, and then he's revealed to them. But there's a deep sense that Jesus gives consolation. Like they're not like, oh, we're sad because of this, and Jesus like, surprise, here, here I am, in the first minute of this thing. He really bears their story of loss, their sense of something that they were betting their lives on dissolving in their hands. And in the midst of that confession is when they find themselves, face to face with the resurrected Christ,
Mhm.
and I think to me, that's evangelism. I mean, evangelism is coming face to face with the word, with the face of Jesus Christ. And
Mhm.
I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, particularly in this time, where we do not have many spaces culturally for consolation, that maybe what evangelism looks like most, maybe the way the church blesses the world, are to be people sent into the world to really bear each other's burdens, to hear their
Mhm.
stories, to have kind of road to Emmaus kind of experiences. And my wager is that Jesus Christ will be revealed in those experiences, not because we control, taking us full circle, control bringing Jesus about, but because in the mystery of faith, Jesus Christ, a la Matthew 25, like you quoted, promises to be present in those
Mhm.
experiences of giving consolation, of giving out of need and of loss.
Yeah, I really love that. I think or I know it resonates with people, this view of evangelism, because at the beginning of September, I basically just used your book on evangelism as like as a tool for Sunday school.
Hmm.
And it wasn't that everyone read through the whole book, um, but we talked a lot about the themes of the book. And this idea that sharing the love of Christ by bearing other people's burdens, both your Christian brothers and sisters and your neighbors who are not Christian, um, for my congregation at least, that just seemed to just make total sense. And I think it
Hmm.
was what what I noticed in that is this sense of like, for many Christians, like most of the Christians I've ever been around, they're actually really good at those things. Like
Hmm.
a lot
Yeah.
of Christians tend to be really good at like calling their, the people in their church that are sick or have cancer or like are in, going through a hard time. Like this is what Christians do. But to frame it as like, but we're actually called also to do that with our neighbors and with
Yeah.
those who are outside of the church, so that they too can see the love of Christ.
Hmm.
And that it just like when I talked about this with my congregation, it was just like everyone was just like, oh yeah, this really makes sense. Like this is the kind of, and I would say like, our congregation and maybe our denomination at large is kind of like that in between evangelical and mainline, where it's like evangelism kind of is like a weird thing that like they're not sure what to
Yep.
do with.
Yep.
And they have all these old images of like Billy Graham Crusade or like, street evangelism tracks, things like that. But it's like just like for most people, it's just like, well, they're just confused about like, well, how do we do evangelism
Hmm.
now? Because I think it'd be as common sense that like that's not what we want to do. But like this
Right.
idea of like, oh, actually the way we engage our Christian brothers and sisters can be the way we engage the world is I have found it very empowering.
Well, that's great. Yeah. And it is to say, like I think one could worry that saying evangelism kind of wears the marks or becomes the act of consolation. Is like, well, that's a cop out. It gets you off of having to ever really testify to anything because you're
Mm,
just being nice to people, and you're doing what but I actually think there is a real impetus to have to speak of this, and it's why the kind of story that runs through the book is really lay people out in the world doing this, and they simply live like with this watchword where,
mhm,
no one, especially in this day and age, it is very rare for people to run into a burning building, like, and I mean that metaphorically, like people who are in deep moments of sorrow and brokenness, most people turn away. Most people don't have time for it. Most people are like not to have to see it, you know. a card that says I'm sorry this happened to you, more likely that, like I said, like a Facebook post that says I'm so sorry, thinking of you, a
Hmm.
text maybe, but to really, really bear another person's burdens and run into that house on fire is a very kind of countercultural moment. And to do that, you do have to testify to why you would go there. Like, why would you, like, if we're really truly calling it hell, like even seeing the cross as an experience of death and loss, a hellish experience, and yet there is God taking what is hellish and broken and bringing life out of it. I mean, that needs to be preached. The cross always needs to be preached because it's not self-evident that this is God working new life out of death. Like this is that there's something profound happening here. Well, in the same way as people go out into the world, this is so kind of counter that there needs to be a sense of preaching, and I don't mean that in a kind of Billy Graham way, but there needs to be a sense that proclaims, that says, as happens in the story in the book, is like, why are you doing this? Well, because we follow Jesus into sorrow. Like we think Jesus is present here, and where we think Jesus Christ is present is where the church goes. And that is a very different view of evangelism in the sense of like we have to bring Jesus because we control Jesus. We
Hmm.
control God. So I mean, we're full circle again here. We control God. God is a product. So evangelism is us bringing the product of God to you and selling it to you, as opposed to saying, no, no, no. What evangelism is that through the Spirit, Jesus Christ is out moving at work, and we are always supposed to go where Jesus Christ is at work and witness to that, point to that, and say, God is moving, God is here. And so why would you run into the burning building of the person at work who's just lost their husband in a car accident and spend any time with them? Because we believe we we follow Jesus Christ into sorrow. And where there is sorrow, we're called to be because Jesus Christ is already present at work, bringing life out of death.
Hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. And I think like if you're showing people who you are in Christ, and you know, if you're really being honest with people about why you're doing it, um, when we think of it, when it's a product, we feel a pressure to get the product right.
Right.
Like we got to present this just right so it's marketable and can be sold. But like if we're like, we're just a witness to what Jesus is doing here and why he's in my life. It's a very different thing because the pressure is not nearly as high. It eliminates the pressure because you're like,
Hmm.
I'm literally just like, I'm here because Jesus has promised to be here. And he showed me that through the cross. And it's like, it's a different, it really, for me as a pastor, thinking about evangelism and about ministry in a community, I think it's just absolutely vital. So thank you, Andy, for coming on the podcast today. This was a
Yeah.
really fun conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to talk with you.
Yeah, appreciate it. So we'll look forward to, do you have any new books in the works that you're working on? You're kind of a book machine. You just like put them out like faster than anybody. So
It's a bit of a disease. I don't know what else to do with myself. So yeah, there's a book coming out in sometime early or first quarter of 2026.
oh, nice.
So yeah,
Okay.
that and this is like totally me failing at the marketing part of this, the gross marketing part, because I can't even remember the title of it. I think it's called something like it's a read of First and Second Kings next to Mainline Decline, if that doesn't
Oh, okay.
pique your
Okay.
interest. So it's called like Baal and the Gods of More or something like that, like reimagining church growth beyond like church growth. So
Yeah. Well,
something like
it's
that.
great. Your ministry of, working on all these topics, so helpful for pastors and for lay people. And so, yeah, we really appreciate you, Andy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. The greatest compliment you can give me is if you pass this episode on to a friend or like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. Take good care.